Hello everyone, and thank you for listening to my presentation. I would like to provide a 1-minute summary. Socially assistive robots have much potential to provide multimodal cognitive training to older adults with mild cognitive impairment. I will present recent work in this area. We conducted a pilot study, which was a 4-week SAR-led music-based cognitive training. 11 older adults with mild cognitive impairment learned how to play the piano, and we measured cognitive function pre-post intervention. Participants experienced improved function in multiple domains by the end of the intervention period. Cognitive function improved in the computed neurocognitive index score, as well as in the verbal memory, executive function, reaction time, and cognitive flexibility domains between visits 1 and 4. This data is highly encouraging, considering the short length of the pilot study. This pilot study suggests that socially assistive robots may improve cognitive function, but longer-term studies are needed to confirm that these cognitive improvements were a result of the robot itself. A follow-up 6-month clinical trial is planned for the near future. My name is Jenay Beer, and it is my pleasure to present to you today my presentation titled Robotics for Persons with Dementia. I am an assistant professor at the University of Georgia in the Institute of Gerontology. The work I will discuss today was conducted as part of a large interdisciplinary effort by the Cognitive Aging Research and Education Center. The Cognitive Aging Research and Education Center is a clinical research and outreach space where we deliver education on dementia, conduct cutting-edge research, and provide planning and support for persons with dementia and their care partners. We are a future telehealth hub and will work with our partners to expand education, diagnosis, and care to rural and underserved communities across the state. We have a number of research programs, all that focus on improving our understanding of dementia. These programs include cognitive assessment, biofactors assessment, robotic social engagement, community education and outreach, tech-supported care support, and robot-led cognitive training. Today I'm going to focus on our most recent user study from our cognitive training research program. Cognitive training has been a growing focus of the center, and the work you will learn about today is one of a series of studies on this very topic. So before we jump into cognitive training, let's first discuss dementia. There are actually lots of types of neurodegenerative disease, but 70% fall into the bucket of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, also known as ADRD. Alzheimer's disease is just one type of dementia. There are actually many types, such as Lewy body disease, Parkinson's disease, Huntington's, ALS, and there are differences in pathophysiology across these different dementias. ADRD does affect mainly older people, but I want to stress it is not a normal part of aging. And unfortunately, we're not close to a cure. It's estimated by the World Health Organization that around 50 million people worldwide have dementia. The brain is a seat of behavior, and cognition is what the brain does. The physical changes to the brain caused by Alzheimer's disease can create dramatic functional changes, such as deterioration in memory, thinking, behavior, and the ability to perform everyday activities. There are different behavioral stages of Alzheimer's disease, and this table was published in 2006. It's one of my favorite depictions of behavioral stages of dementia, ranging from mild cognitive impairment, or MCI, to severe Alzheimer's disease. Again, this table is from 2006. It does a nice job, but it's important to note that people are now actually living much longer with the disease than this table shows, in part because we're better at earlier diagnosis, and we're also better at managing symptoms and safety. So you'll see that the first stage is mild cognitive impairment, MCI. Now, there is some debate here where some researchers posit that MCI is part of the disease process, while others argue that it's actually a separate issue. Only 15% of people who exhibit MCI will actually convert to mild Alzheimer's within a year period. In fact, some people will live their entire older adult life with MCI, not converting over to Alzheimer's. However, on the other side of the coin, 84% of people with Alzheimer's disease started with MCI at one point. So whatever the debate regarding definition, MCI is a good place to start with cognitive training. These folks do experience isolated deficits and memory impairment, but they can still engage in complex tasks. So they have a lot to gain from cognitive training. So cognitive training has been shown to be effective in secondary prevention. In other words, preventing the conversion of MCI to dementia. In fact, a recent meta-analysis suggested that cognitive training can actually enhance cognitive function among individuals with MCI. And this is most likely by increasing cognitive reserve. So what is cognitive training exactly? I'm sure many of you have heard the term use it or lose it. And there's actually a lot of evidence that suggests that this is true. Cognitive training is the implementation of guided tasks that are designed to reflect and ultimately improve specific cognitive functions. Cognitive training can be thought of as structured practice. And like most practice aimed at skill building, there's many different types of cognitive training programs and techniques. So for example, there's a lot of cognitive training out there that targets a single cognitive domain. For example, memory games can improve memory. If you read books, that can improve verbal fluency. Crossword puzzles can also improve verbal fluency. So the effectiveness of cognitive training in persons with MCI depends on how that training is structured. For example, multi-domain training is thought to provide a greater range of cognitive challenge and increased stimulation of cognitive plasticity compared to single domain training. Other considerations such as the length of the training, whether it's self-guided, whether it's conducted at home or in a social setting, all these things impact the success of cognitive training in persons with MCI. So I mentioned that multi-domain cognitive training is ideal. What does that mean? Well, tasks that require the whole brain are most effective in creating meaningful cognitive functional improvements, particularly if that complex task is novel. In other words, learning something new later in life is the best form of cognitive training. Musical engagement, in particular, provides an excellent multimodal task for studying neuroplasticity. So think about it. To learn an instrument, participants must integrate sensory processing, music language learning, motor learning, affective processing, and a number of other cognitive processes. Let's consider playing the piano. Piano playing has a strong visual component. It's kind of like a coding task or learning symbols on a page that have meaning, similar to reading a new language. There's also a motor component by pressing keys in rhythm or in time with the music. There's an auditory component in listening. And just as importantly, there's a social component by interaction with the instructor. So this is a whole brain task. In fact, older adults who learned an instrument in childhood retain the benefits of this training-induced plasticity into older age. Consequently, it's not surprising that engagement in music has been related to a decreased risk in dementia and MCI. For instance, 6 months of individualized piano instruction has been associated with improved performance in measures of cognitive functioning and working memory. So this leads to our pilot study, where we have a team, an interdisciplinary team, developing and evaluating a socially assistive robot to deliver cognitive training. This work couldn't be done without this interdisciplinary team, and I'd like to recognize the other main investigators on the project, as well as the many students who make this possible. So let me start with the goals and research questions for this pilot study. So first, we wanted to know whether SAR-led cognitive training is feasible in actually facilitating improvements in cognitive functioning. We also wanted to understand the facilitators and the barriers influencing user adoption. And finally, how do social and functional design features of the SAR contribute to user attitudes toward usability? So for this study, we used a robot developed by Robotics. And we named the robot Mari, that stands for Musical Assistive Robot Instructor. Because this pilot study investigated feasibility, we created a Wizard of Oz interface to control the robot. This way, an operator could control the robot and control the utterances. You can see the Wizard of Oz user interface on the right. The dashboard was used to calibrate and set up the robot, as well as control the robot utterances related to the piano lesson content. You can see buttons for each lesson content component. And that launched the robot to introduce a learning concept and provide playing instructions. On the left, you will see a list of feedback utterances. These utterances include positive reinforcement and encouragement. The operator would choose the appropriate feedback depending on the older adult's progression through the lesson. Here is the experimental setup. The operator controlled the robot through the Wizard of Oz setup using computer 1. The participant sat at computer 2. Here, the participant sat in front of a full weighted key keyboard and a computer screen which displayed the lesson content. For this pilot study, we used commercially available lessons called Scoof. The robot was situated next to the screen where it would read aloud instructions, provide feedback, and gesture to the screen and the keyboard. So we carefully designed this Wizard of Oz interaction so that Mari was an encouraging instructor. The participants engaged in 4 lessons once per week over the course of a month. The robot would start with learning concepts. Participants had no music experience prior to the study, and they first learned about notes and rhythm, then playing with one hand, and then eventually playing short songs with 2 hands. The feedback the robot provided to the participants, that the design of that was important. The robot was always positive and encouraging, even when the participant was making mistakes. We worded the feedback in such a way to reduce feelings of stress. So for example, one utterance example was Mari saying, "I know this can be hard, but you're doing a great job." Again, this was a Wizard of Oz study, so there was a human operator in the loop at all times. Although the participants were aware that the robot was remotely operated, they still were inclined to talk to the robot and ask it questions. For the most part, we anticipated many of these question answers. However, if the participant asked something that the robot was not pre-prepared to address, the robot would refer to the researcher. In this pilot study, participants visited the lab for 4 weeks. We recruited 11 older adults with mild cognitive impairment, and the procedure summary is provided here. In visit 1, we assessed cognitive function and music aptitude. The robot then led the piano lessons, which were about 30 minutes long. We measured stress, workload, robot social attributes, technology acceptance. The same lesson format was used for all visits. And then participants were required to engage at in-home practice. We equipped them with a full keyboard in their own home, and Mari assigned them homework assignments that they were to complete each week. In visit 4, participants completed the piano lesson and the HRI measurements. They also then completed the cognitive measures and music aptitude measures as they did in visit 1. This was designed so we would gather pre-post cognition data. I'd like to share some preliminary results with you today. As you can see, we measured a lot of different constructs in this pilot study, and today I'm going to focus primarily on the cognition and the social attributes data. And we're currently in the process of writing this up for publication. So, cognition data. We collected a lot of cognition and health data, and this table depicts the cognitive measures only. So let me first orient you to this graph before we get into the numbers. So at the top of the graph, you can see the average TICS and MMSE scores. And this indicates that on average, our participants were categorized as having mild cognitive impairment. The domain-specific cognitive testing was collected at Visit 1 and Visit 4 using CNS vital signs. CNS vital signs is a computerized neurocognitive and behavioral assessment tool. This software provides clinicians and researchers neurocognitive evaluation along several cognitive domains that you see listed here. Those are listed in the rows. This is a lot of data, so let me highlight just a few specific cognitive domains. Essentially, reading this table from left to right, you can see here the results of the CNS assessment to determine domain-specific cognitive functioning, and you can see the % change in functioning across the intervention. In the right-hand column, you will find the p-value to determine significant differences, as indicated by a p-value less than 0.05. Briefly, participants experienced improved cognitive function in multiple domains by the end of the intervention period. So cognitive function improved in the Computed Neurocognitive Index score, as well as the verbal memory, executive function, reaction time, and cognitive flexibility domains. And this is a change between Visit 1 and Visit 4. This data is highly encouraging considering the short length of the pilot study. During the short pilot interventions, there was no significant difference in composite memory, visual memory, processing speed, reasoning, or psychomotor speed. We collected a range of HRI-related data. However, I just want to highlight one particular scale here. And I'll just cover one scale just for the interest of time. This is the Robotics Social Attribute Scale, or ROSAS. This is a commonly used 18-item HRI tool, and it was adopted from the Godspeed scale from the psychological literature on social perception. So this scale is used in HRI to measure users' perceptions of a robot's social attributes. This measure has 3 scale dimensions: competence, discomfort, and warmth. So this scale was administered at every single lesson. And you can see that the participants rated the robot's competence as high, as indicated by the red line. Their perceptions of robot competence actually increased as the lessons became more difficult. This means that participants viewed Mari as a competent piano instructor. Discomfort was low across all 4 weeks, which is great. That data is depicted in purple. And then finally, warmth is depicted in gray. You can see participants rated the robot's warmth as moderate across all 4 weeks. This was interesting as we consider from an HRI perspective the role of the robot. We were careful to construct the utterances in such a way where the robot's role as an instructor was clear. However, we may have sacrificed some user perceptions of robot warmth and approachability. Thus, we think there's some room for improvement here. We want to strike the right balance between the robot's role as a serious instructor, but also we want it to be socially engaging. So, what does all this mean? Well, 11 participants with MCI participated in our feasibility study. At the end of the intervention period, participants improved in a number of cognitive domains, which is consistent with past work from our laboratory as well as others. Thus, socially assistive robots may improve cognitive function. So I want to stress that although we found significant improvement in some cognitive domains, we are careful to say that socially assistive robots may improve cognitive function. We cannot yet confirm this. In order to say definitively that robots can improve cognition, a longer intervention period is needed. A longer intervention will help confirm that the cognitive improvements are attributable solely to the robot, above and beyond practice effects from the repeated cognitive testing. We also need to determine whether or not the effects are long-lasting. Previous piano learning cognitive training protocols suggest that substantial improvements can be found with a significantly longer cognitive training duration. Typically, you'll see around 6 months. Additional testing from our laboratory and others using longer protocols and appropriate controls would determine whether additional training time yields improvements in cognitive function of greater magnitude than those we observed here. Longer protocols and additional testing are also needed to more accurately capture changes in musical aptitude. So through this pilot study, we have a number of lessons learned that I would like to share with you. First, in creating this sort of complex HRI, I have to say it's really difficult. Piano learning requires executing complex and novel movements, engaging working memory, identifying matches and mismatches in pitch and rhythm, maintaining sustained attention, and identifying the mood or tone of a piece. Each of these cognitively taxing tasks is usually guided by a human instructor who not only teaches and demonstrates mechanics, but they also coach and guide music listening exercises to help learners associate fundamental concepts such as tempo, with an emotional tone or image. So the fact that participants expressed the feeling that Mari was a competent teacher and that they, showed some improvement in cognitive function, this is very, very, very promising, particularly considering this was a Wizard of Oz study. Also promising is that when asked if they could use the robot to learn to play piano if it were offered to them for free, 10 out of 11 participants responded that they would. But there's a lot of work yet to be done. So we are nearly ready to actually start a 6-month clinical trial with the robot. And so there are a number of things to improve upon regarding the design of the human-robot interaction. So first, in this phase 1 study, we actually did pilot a few objective measures using a tension tracker. We used a thermal sensor, heart rate monitor. And this data was not really all that conclusive in terms of from a behavioral standpoint. It was primarily implemented in this phase 1 just to test the sensor capability. However, these capabilities will be further developed in our phase 2 development. And it's important to ensure that participants are sustaining attention on the lesson, and the thermal tracker will detect changes in the participant's stress level, which will help us determine the difficulty level of the cognitive training content. Next, we're carefully assessing qualitative interview data from our participants to understand their perceptions of the robot's personality and the interaction. Designing an instructor that is not only competent, but also warm and engaging, that's important. We are adding opportunities for the robot to have a little bit of humor and express joy in its instruction. Along the same thread, one thing that has happened quite often during the phase 1 data collection was that participants unexpectedly went off of our anticipated script, and they tried to have conversations with the robot beyond the piano lesson content. This is kind of funny considering they knew that the robot was remotely operated. But I actually have a funny example. One participant arrived at the session and wanted to compliment Mari, and she said, "Mari, you have beautiful eyes." To which the operator, a poor graduate student, panicked a little bit because we overlooked including a Wizard of Oz button for the robot to say thank you. So to the compliment, "Mari, you have beautiful eyes," the robot simply replied with, "Yes." So it's a very confident robot. So joking aside, the interaction could benefit from future research in natural language processing, so a more dynamic conversational exchange can happen. As I've highlighted before, multimodal tasks are ideal for cognitive training, and we're currently creating custom lesson content that includes both piano playing and music listening. Our future 6-month custom lessons will include music learning concepts of notation, rhythm, theory, technique, and dynamics. So this is a much more in-depth lesson format than we used in the phase 1. And we're carefully constructing these lessons to promote this multimodal experience, therefore leveraging the robot's ability to convey cognitive training that would be most impactful to our older adults. Our clinical trial will also test an autonomous version of this robot, an autonomous version of delivering this lesson content. The robot will progress through the lessons with no remote operator, tracking user performance along the way. It is also important that the lesson progression is tailored for the older adult. No two persons with cognitive impairment are the same, and there will be individual differences in their ability to progress through the content. Furthermore, there will be differences for each individual. Persons with dementia have good days, sometimes they have bad days, and there may be times where a person's progression through the lesson will actually backtrack, and we are prepared to offer that flexibility. Finally, regarding user capability, we're also expanding our recruitment to include users with a larger range of cognitive impairment, and we will also include a much larger sample size. So cognitive training is complex, and designing a human-robot interaction to support long-lasting and effective improvements in cognitive function is no easy feat. In fact, the participants expressed the feeling that Mari was a competent teacher and that they may have improved cognitive function. That's very, very promising. Also promising is that when asked if they want to use the robot, they were excited to do so and expressed interest in adopting the robot. Our next steps are underway. The development of a SAR that can be autonomously employed is currently under development, and it will deliver engaging, personalized music training to individual users of varying cognitive abilities. I would like to acknowledge the interdisciplinary team working on this project, as well as NIH for funding this research. Thank you so much for listening.